This was the Midwest a few weeks ago. Another blizzard. After a brutal winter, a cold and snowy spring. Climate scientists used to say winters would be a thing of the past because of climate change. Now they say it's making them worse. They also blame climate change for war, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, and even a decline in mental health. The world now spends $1 billion a day to keep the Earth from warming. Al Gore says the Earth is like a sick child that has a fever. And we're told that 97% of scientists believe climate change is happening. But is it? In his best-selling book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, climate skeptic Marc Morano shares the facts you haven't been told and argues that the bad news about the Earth's climate is wrong.
Well, this is an intriguing title. It's called A Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. I thought it'd be something I'd be glad to get hold of. It's fascinating. And the author of it is Marc Morano. He's joining us. He's with something called Climate Depot. Marc, it's good to have you with us.
Hey,
thanks.
Thank you, Pat. Happy to be here. Appreciate it.
You've been called everything, MF and all the dirty words you can think of. You've been vilified around the country. Why?
Because I've committed heresy in their minds. I've stood up to the United Nations and Al Gore and challenged their doctrine of man-made climate change. And that's what they do. They intimidate, threaten.
Down the road, say 20 years from now, is Miami going to be underwater? Is Hawaii going to be underwater? Is the New York, the streets of Manhattan going to be flooded? What's coming off?
Well, what's coming on is in the book, I actually detail peer-reviewed studies showing that there's been no acceleration in sea level. And Al Gore in his film shows that, Florida's half underwater, not just Miami. Miami is actually sinking. It's called subsidence. But there's no acceleration in the global sea level, so you cannot link that to mankind is always battling the shores. Sea levels have been rising for 10,000 plus years since the end of the last ice age. And for right now, for Gore to come up with all these future scare scenarios and get people terrified when there's no scientific basis right now for that at all, that's one of the cons, is what I call this, in this climate debate. They scare people. And when current reality fails to scare them, whether it's temperature, polar bears, sea level, they make scarier and scarier predictions of the future so they can try to get up support.
What is the ultimate game? Is it some kind of a power play to take over the world economy? Is that what it is?
Well, since the 1960s, the modern environmental movement has been essentially hijacked by the left. And what they've tried to do, and in the book I go back to the 1960s and 70s to the other environmental scares, things like resource scarcity, we're going to run out of food, we're going to have famines, we're going to have overpopulation, there's too many people, the global cooling scare. Mm-hmm. And I show that those scares all had the same solutions they're proposing today. It was a different environmental scare, same solution. And the solutions are centralized planning, wealth redistribution, mm-hmm. and sovereignty-threatening international organizations. And the UN is very open. Environmental climate policy isn't about the environment. We want to redistribute wealth by climate policy. They openly call for global governance. So they're just using global warming as the latest environmental scare in order to achieve that agenda.
Well, what about that Paris Accord when the president came out of that one? What is it they wanted to do in that accord?
Well, that has been now analyzed, and it's the most expensive treaty in world history. $100 trillion is the estimated cost. We're already spending $1 trillion a day.
Trillion?
That's the estimate by Bjørn Lomborg, a Danish statistician, looking at this, and it would achieve nothing. And here's the thing: not only would it cost money, not only would it commit nations to lose sovereignty and start being essentially having to bow to a UN international organization, but it would have, even if you trusted the UN science and Al Gore believed everything they said, it would have no impact on temperatures 100 years from now. So it's all a massive bureaucratic wealth redistribution scheme to do nothing for the climate if, in fact, we actually faced a crisis. I like to say that this is no more than medieval witchcraft. People believe that the United Nations and the United States EPA can regulate the temperature and control storminess. They used to believe that in the Middle Ages. Those witches can control weather. Those witches are causing crop failure. Now they're blaming our SUVs and our cars.
Well, you also point out in the book a number of hypocrites who are leading the charge. And you mentioned my friend Al Gore as a principal polluter. What does he do?
Al Gore, and this is part of the problem, is the public hasn't bought this. According to Gallup polling, there's no change in concern, essentially, from global warming from the 1980s to now. And one of the reasons is people like Al Gore don't follow their own advice. Right. He lives with multiple homes, private jets, huge carbon footprint, but he preaches to everyone else that we should be, taking baths together to save water, that we should be biking to work, that we should be, watching every little bit of our carbon footprint. He himself is unwilling to do it. That tells the public that this is nonsense, that the people who are trying to do this scare aren't living the way they are claiming to.
Talked about Arnold Schwarzenegger flying a jet between L.A. and Sacramento.
Daily commuting.
Is that right?
Yeah, he daily commuted to the governor's mansion. At the same time, he went to have a trial to try the oil companies for murder. And then while he's calling for a trial to prosecute the oil companies, he's promoting helicopter rides. He also drove a Humvee. But at the same time, at the governor's mansion, he urged California residents to air dry their clothes on clotheslines. And meanwhile, no one saw his underwear hanging on a clothesline at the governor's mansion, but they did see him commuting by private jet. This is that old... It's almost like the Soviet Politburo. You have one standard for the party insiders. Yeah. You can live in lavish, and then the masses have to follow all the rules and regulations, and they have to be kept in check. And that's basically what we have. Whether it's Leonardo DiCaprio, the UN top official from the climate panel, said he lived at 30,000 feet. He flew all the time to all these exotic conferences of the United Nations, but they preach everyone else has to follow their strict rules.
Is there a possibility of a major ice age coming? I mean, rather than this warming stuff, the planet may be getting cooler?
Yes. In fact, many scientists, including Russian scientists, solar scientists, are predicting a coming cooling. But here's the thing. It's not about whether it's carbon dioxide or whether it's even the sun. In the book, I detail and I interview Nobel Prize-winning scientists and Princeton physicists and former United Nations scientists who turned against the UN. It's quite literally hundreds of factors that influence the climate. Mm-hmm. So right now they're trying to analyze what's going on. By some estimates, we're at 100-year or more sunspot low activity. And many people are predicting a coming cooling. Just the last 2 years have seen a significant drop in temperature since the height of the last ocean cycle of El Nino. So yes, global cooling is possible. Don't know how severe it's going to be. They always say prediction is very hard, especially about the future. And so I don't like to get into predicting in this game, but we do know that nothing unusual is happening, whether it's hurricanes, floods, tornadoes. Extreme weather is actually on a stable or declining trend on climate timescale.
It comes out of the sun, doesn't it? I mean, and that has nothing to do with SUVs.
That's right.
Yeah, really?
Yes, and one of the things I detail in the book is we had the medieval warm period from about 900 to 1300 AD. This was considered the climate optimum. That was the word was optimum. And we had the Renaissance. We had all this crops and vineyards growing, and England had booming production. And then in recent times, they said UN scientists said we had to get rid of the medieval warm period because we didn't have coal plants and SUVs, and it was inconvenient to explain how something could be as warm or warmer than today. So they went back in the data, and they erased the medieval warm period. They erased the 1930s in the United States as the hottest decade. They went back and cooled the past, all to show as a campaign cause that the temperatures are allegedly unprecedented today.
So you're saying they're lying about the stats?
I'm saying, here's what I'm saying. It's hard to say that because the individual scientists will look at science and they'll say, oh, all these scientists can't be in on some big con, right? But if you study butterflies and no one's paying attention, but you say, how will climate change 50 to 100 years affect the butterfly? And you come up with a bunch of predictions. Mm-hmm. You haven't done anything wrong. You're just using models. And you say, oh, the butterfly could be greatly affected or it could not be. Well, the media is going to seize on, oh, the butterfly could be doomed. Your university is going to like it. You're going to get funding. You're going to get more study. You're going to get university staff. All of a sudden, you're part of this alleged phony 97% consensus. So it's not that they're lying. It's that they're crafting a narrative. And this is what it is. It's like a campaign cause. They squash anything negative and they promote only that which fits their narrative.
We had a recent president, who said global warming was the greatest threat facing civilization, didn't he?
And it's a tragedy that there wasn't enough pushback on President Obama for saying that. It's the greatest threat we face. It is changing climate is in the history of the Earth. Right now, we're in probably the 10% coldest period in the Earth's geologic history. In other words, 90% of the Earth has been warmer than today. We have not had it where we could have ice at both poles like we do now. So geologically speaking, nothing unusual is going on. So for President Obama to say that is beyond science. That's becoming a religious belief. And by the way, the head of the UN climate panel actually said, and I'm not making this up, global warming is my religion. Quote. That's his exact quote. This was the guy in charge of deciding how these big authoritative reports that John Kerry, our former Secretary of State, liked to call the gold standard, run by essentially a climate religious advocate doing this.
Let me ask you, what about the anarchy? What's happening down there at the southern pole, by the way?
Yes. Now, in the ice, in Antarctica, the South Pole, NASA study shows it's actually growing. The ice, the land-based glacier ice, has been expanding, and it's contributing to a sea level lowering. In other words, it's actually growing so much, and it's actually been through a cooling phase. Now, the Arctic, people will say, oh, well, he's not talking about the Arctic. Well, the Arctic at the North Pole, there's studies showing that the 1920s, 30s may have had a similar amounts of ice, that it's very cyclical. And keep in mind, they put in satellites, started monitoring the Arctic back in the 1970s when we were going through the global cooling phase. So it's not unreasonable to say the Arctic has warmed since everyone was worried about a coming ice age and global cooling in the 1970s.
Have you had death threats?
Yes, I've had, and actually detail that in the book, and actually just got one the other day with death wishes and death threats and threats against me and my family. This is how they operate. They try to silence, intimidate, and I go through, it's not me, it's the scientists who are actually battling this issue. Their careers have been ruined, their universities, they've lost jobs, they've lost funding, they've lost prestige, all because they stand up to this alleged science issue. And I say alleged because it's treated more as a religious issue.
It's incredible. But have they sold it to the general public or not?
They haven't. Polling data still shows global warming ranks, 19, 20 out of the top 20 issues. The problem is they have sold it to kids. And one of the things I spend a lot of time on in the book is the indoctrination of children, Pat. From kindergarten through college, children are being indoctrinated from day one on we're all going to die. Our modern way of living is destroying the earth. And I actually interviewed college students when I was in South Africa at a UN climate summit. And they actually said that the American way of life is total BS, and that the poor people in the developing world, people who don't have running water and electricity, are the ones living earth-friendly. I featured California Governor Jerry Brown saying that the Africa can't emulate the United States wealth because the earth can't handle it. And this is where you get to the sinister agenda, because Al Gore, I also feature him saying that we need ubiquitous fertility management. In other words, we need to prevent the number of Africans, because he says Africa is projected to have a huge population increase. A white, wealthy Western politician telling at a Bill Gates function, televised, that we have too many people of color in the developing world and we need fertility management to prevent that. He gets away with it.
He said that?
It's in the book. And I have the video as well. He says we need ubiquitous fertility management because the world is projected, Africa is projected to have so many people.
He would be condemned as an absolute racist. I mean, that's the most racist thing you could possibly imagine.
But this is how it is. And sadly and unfortunately, Pope Francis has lined himself with advisors that have a similar mindset. He's done very anti-Catholic doctrine with his advisors. There are people who believe that, overpopulation and fertility management and family planning and international agencies and all sorts of things the Catholic Church preaches against. He's allowed the Catholic Church now to align themselves, what I call an unholy alliance. And it's continuing, though. So it's infecting all parts of our culture, but particularly children. And I always say every parent or grandparent of a kid needs to have this book because it's the ultimate reference book to push back against teachers and schools.
It's the most frightening thing that this becomes a religion, that people will be destroyed if they go against that religion, and their lives will be threatened. I mean, death threats.
Yes, but that's been the case for years, and this has been. It's gone from science to dogma.
Yeah.
And Al Gore claimed back in the early 90s that there were no science, that all scientists agreed. Now, this 97% I point out in the book, in one of the studies, wasn't even 97 scientists. They actually had 77 scientists, anonymous, we don't know who they are, and they claimed a 97% consensus. And a UN scientist said the 97% claim was pulled out of thin air. They used that to bully people. In other words, you don't know enough about science, you can't challenge it. It's like the old toothpaste ads. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this, or the Dentine gum ads. Yeah. They're trying to use that to intimidate. Who are you to question all these scientists? Well, it's actually, I point out, a core of activist UN scientists, people like Michael Oppenheimer, who took money from Barbara Streisand, $250,000, who work for activist environmental groups. And many of these groups, United Union of Concerned Scientists or active environmental groups, they work for the federal government and they do reports that sound like they're written by Greenpeace. And many of them are written by Greenpeace, but they have the federal government stamp on them. This is how they've co-opted science and turned this into a quasi-religion and a intimidation effort where you cannot dissent.
Is Mars getting cooler? There's one of those planets that was getting cooler. There weren't any SUVs.
It was Mars getting warmer, is what people. But that we don't get too much. Mars has a different atmosphere, and so once you get into studying other planets and the impact, each atmosphere of each planet is very different. But it's a point. You just look at all you have to do is look at the Earth's history. And one of the scientists, a Princeton physicist, I point out in the book, he says we're currently in a carbon dioxide famine on Earth. In other words, this is one of the lowest levels of carbon dioxide we've had. We've had ice ages with many times higher carbon dioxide. So this whole idea that the public is in a panic, it's not about science. It's literally about their agenda. And that's what I point out in the book. When I interviewed the UN climate chief, she said, Cristina Figueres, we seek a centralized transformation that will make life on planet Earth very different. That's the UN climate chief. She's now a step down, but that was her goal.
Centralized transformation.
Centralized transformation that will make life very different. Do we really want our life very different and run by the United Nations? People need to wake up. And fortunately, President Trump, and you see the attacks he's under with all the daily attacks, and his EPA chief, the same thing, Scott Pruitt.
Yeah.
He has committed heresy in Washington. He's done what no other Republican EPA chief has done. And I'll repeat that. Scott Pruitt, Donald Trump's EPA chief, has done what no other Republican EPA chief. He's stood up to the climate change establishment. George W. Bush appointees didn't do it. And George H.W. Bush appointees didn't do it. He's done it, and they are going after him, filing through 20-year-old real estate deals. They are trying to get rid of him because he had the audacity to try to actually fulfill Donald Trump's campaign promises on climate, which they cannot fathom in Washington.
I hope. Has your book been successful? I think it probably has.
Yes, it's been ranked an Amazon bestseller. It's actually in its third printing, and it's been sold out for a while at Walmart and Amazon, but now it's back in stock, and we're really, and I just presented it to the EPA chief this week, so
good for you.
I'm hoping this gets some traction inside the Trump administration.
It's fascinating. Climate change, the politically incorrect guide. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to resist this stuff. I mean, I believe in the biblical religion, but I think these phony religions based on one world government and the control of human beings by a centralized authority is just not what we want. And if it's being sold under the guise of climate change, we've got to do something about it. So good to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pat. I appreciate it.
God bless you.